If you grew up anywhere near money in the 1990s, or even just watched a lot of television, you know this wall. You didn't need to be told what it meant. You just felt it. It's the wall between the marble-floored foyer and the formal dining room. It's the wall behind the home office desk in every direct-to-video erotic thriller. It's the wall Tony Montana definitely would have had if Scarface got a 90s reboot. It's the wall that made you age 9, standing in your friend's house for a birthday party, suddenly and violently aware that your family did not have enough money. We're talking, of course, about the in-wall aquarium, the built-in, load-bearing, 1,000-gallon centerpiece of peak 90s American excess. Not a fish tank sitting in a room, a fish tank replacing a wall, a liquid, glowing, living piece of architecture spliced directly into the studs of a McMansion somewhere in Bel Air, or Boca Raton, or a gated new-build subdivision in suburban Ohio that was doing its very best impression of Bel Air. This wasn't a hobby. A hobby is something you do on a weekend. This was a statement. This was wealth translated directly into cubic feet of engineered seawater suspended inside your living room wall. Because a hobby doesn't require its own dedicated plumbing system, its own service contract, and its own repairman on speed dial. Think about the sheer audacity of the concept for a second. At the exact moment American luxury interior design was at its most maximalist, dark cherry wood, brass fixtures, ornate crown molding, the whole old money trying very hard to look like even older money aesthetic. Someone decided the missing ingredient was saltwater biology. Not a painting, not a chandelier, a living reef ecosystem held together by silicone and hope, glowing an alien futuristic blue against 3,000 square feet of traditional millwork. It shouldn't have worked. A restoration hardware catalog and a public aquarium should not, by any design logic, belong in the same square footage. And yet, for about 15 years, this was the look. It appeared in sitcoms, in rap videos, in real estate listings that used the phrase sunken living room unironically. It became so specifically aggressively of its era that today, encountering one, untouched, original, glowing away in some time capsule house that's still on the market after 18 months, feels less like walking into a home and more like walking into a diorama of a very particular kind of American dream. So here's the question this video is actually about. Why this? Why did wealthy Americans, at this exact 10 to 15-year window, decide that the ultimate flex wasn't a bigger pool or a home theater or a wine cellar, though they usually had those too, but a wall-mounted ocean? The answer, it turns out, isn't just because it looked cool, although it absolutely did. It's a genuinely fascinating collision of three separate things happening at exactly the same moment in American history. A materials science revolution in acrylic manufacturing that made tanks of this scale physically possible for the first time. A parallel revolution in marine biology and reef-keeping technology that made keeping saltwater the hardest, most volatile category of aquarium life, survivable outside of a public aquarium, and a culture of economic boom-time excess that demanded increasingly baroque, increasingly impractical displays of disposable wealth. Take away any one of those three ingredients, and the trend doesn't happen. You need the acrylic. You need the reef science. And, critically, you need an economy so flush with cash that spending 6 figures on a wall that requires weekly professional maintenance forever seemed like a reasonable idea. This is the story of how a fish tank became architecture, how marine biology became interior design, and how, for one glittering chlorine and salt-scented decade, the single most expensive thing you could put in your house wasn't solid at all. It was alive. Let's go behind the glass. Chapter 2. The Tech Boom Behind the Wall. To understand why the in-wall aquarium is specifically a 90s phenomenon, and not, say, a 1970s one or a 1950s one, you have to understand a problem that plagued aquarium design for the better part of a century. Glass has a size limit. Glass is heavy, it's brittle, and its tensile strength drops off a cliff as panes get larger. A big glass aquarium needs thicker and thicker panes to hold back the water pressure, and at a certain point, the glass gets so heavy and so expensive that building anything beyond a few hundred gallons stops being practical for a private residence. Public aquariums could get around this with steel framing and massive engineering budgets. Your dentist's waterfront property in Boca could not. Acrylic changed everything. Cast acrylic sheeting, the same basic material used in aircraft canopies and submarine viewports, is roughly 17 times stronger than glass by weight, and critically, it can be thermoformed. That means it can be heated and bent into curves, seamlessly bonded panel to panel, using a chemical welding process rather than mechanical fasteners, and scaled up to sizes that would be structurally suicidal in glass. This technology wasn't brand new in the 90s. Acrylic aquarium construction had existed in commercial and public aquarium contexts since the 1960s and 70s. But what changed in the late 80s and into the 90s was accessibility. Manufacturing techniques matured. A cottage industry of custom acrylic fabricators sprang up specifically to serve the luxury residential market. And, crucially, the price came down from public institution to extremely wealthy private individual. Suddenly, a residential contractor could commission a custom acrylic tank, shaped specifically to fit a wall opening, curved, angled, wrapped around a corner, built to follow the exact geometry of a foyer. This is the part that made these builds feel like architecture instead of furniture. A glass tank is a box you place in a room. An acrylic in-wall tank is a bespoke vessel, poured and formed to the exact dimensions of the hole you cut in your house. It's bespoke in the truest sense, closer to a stained glass church window than a Petco impulse purchase. But size and shape were only half the equation. The other half, arguably the harder engineering problem, was keeping the water alive. Here's something that trips people up. For most of aquarium history, keeping a thriving saltwater reef tank with live coral, anemones, and a genuinely diverse fish population was borderline impossible outside of a research facility. Saltwater ecosystems are dramatically less forgiving than freshwater ones. Tiny fluctuations in salinity, pH, temperature, or lighting spectrum can crash an entire tank in days. For decades, reef tank was a phrase that lived mostly in marine biology departments, not living rooms. Then, through the late 1980s and accelerating hard through the 90s, the hobbyist reef-keeping world had its own quiet technological revolution, one that ran in parallel with, and eventually merged directly into, the luxury home building industry. 3 innovations mattered most. First, metal halide lighting. Coral reefs need an extremely specific, extremely intense light spectrum to survive, something no household bulb could replicate. Metal halide lamps, adapted from industrial and stadium lighting applications, finally gave hobbyists access to a light source powerful and spectrally correct enough to keep photosynthetic coral alive long-term. It's also, not coincidentally, the light source responsible for that iconic glow, that shimmering, rippling blue-white light dancing across the water's surface that became visual shorthand for luxury reef tank in film and TV for the next 20 years. Second, protein skimmers. This is unglamorous but essential. A protein skimmer is a device that uses a column of fine air bubbles to pull dissolved organic waste out of salt water before it breaks down into toxic compounds. Before affordable, effective protein skimmers became widely available, saltwater tanks accumulated waste faster than filtration could handle it, leading to the algae blooms and fish die-offs that made large-scale reef keeping so unreliable. Improved skimmer design in the 80s and 90s effectively solved the water quality problem at a residential scale for the first time. Third, the broader maturation of the live rock and biological filtration approach, using porous bacteria-colonized rock as a natural nitrogen cycle filter, rather than relying purely on mechanical and chemical filtration. This, combined with skimmers and metal halides, is what finally made a genuinely stable, long-term visually spectacular reef tank, achievable outside of an institution. Put these three technologies together, and by the early 90s, you had, for the first time in history, the technical ability to build a massive, structurally sound, visually stunning saltwater reef tank and keep it thriving for years. What had been a research-grade challenge became, with enough money, a purchasable product. And that's the crucial pivot point, because once something becomes purchasable, it becomes a status symbol. The technology didn't create the trend on its own. It created the possibility of the trend. What turned that possibility into an actual cultural phenomenon was the last piece of the puzzle: architecture. Because here's the thing nobody tells you when they show you the glowing wall. What you're looking at is maybe a third of the actual system. The real engineering marvel is on the other side of that wall. A proper 90s in-wall aquarium build required what the trade called a service access, or fish room. A dedicated, often walk-in space built directly behind the display tank, invisible from the showside rooms, packed with the actual life support infrastructure, a sump tank, a secondary reservoir that holds excess water and houses filtration equipment, the protein skimmer, dosing pumps for calcium and trace elements, heaters, chillers, redundant pumps, and often an entire electrical subpanel dedicated solely to keeping several hundred gallons of ocean alive. This is the part that separates the in-wall aquarium from literally any other decorative choice a wealthy homeowner could make in the 90s. You weren't just buying a tank. You were commissioning a piece of building infrastructure, on par, structurally and electrically, with a home theater or a wine cellar, except this one could die if the power went out for 6 hours. The formula that emerged by the mid-90s, refined by a small handful of specialty firms serving the luxury residential market, looked something like this. Frame a load-bearing opening in a non-structural interior wall between two high-visibility rooms, foyer to dining, foyer to office, living to family room. Commission a custom acrylic tank precisely sized to that opening, often curved or beveled to match the room's sightlines. Build a dedicated equipment room on the reverse side with its own door, drain, and ventilation. Wrap the visible tank edges in matching millwork, mahogany, cherry, sometimes brass trim. So the aquarium reads not as an appliance but as a piece of the house itself. And finally, run dedicated electrical and plumbing lines to support it all, independent of the home's general systems. So a filtration failure wouldn't take down the kitchen. The result wasn't a fish tank in a wall. It was a room, disguised as a wall, disguised as furniture with an ocean living inside it. And once builders and architects realized they could construct something this dramatic, this technically impressive, and this expensive, well, word got around fast in the kind of neighborhoods where word getting around fast was the entire point. Chapter 3. The 90s Architectural Aesthetic. Let's talk about why this actually looked the way it looked. Because the aesthetic logic of the 90s in-wall aquarium is stranger and more interesting than rich people like fish. The dominant luxury interior language of the late 80s and 90s was, broadly, a kind of maximalist neo-traditionalism. Dark hardwoods, mahogany, cherry, sometimes a heavily stained oak, covering walls, ceilings, and custom cabinetry. Brass fixtures, brass stair rails, brass everything. Because brass was to the 90s what matte black is to today. Ornate crown molding, coffered ceilings, sunken living rooms, heavy, formal furniture that gestured at European aristocracy, even when the house itself was 3 years old and built on a golf course in a subdivision that used to be a cornfield. This was a design language obsessed with signaling permanence and old money, even when the money was extremely new. The dark wood, the classical detailing, the formal room layouts, foyer, formal living room, formal dining room, distinct from the casual family room. All of it was borrowed vocabulary from a much older aristocratic tradition, remixed for a newly wealthy suburban American class that had, in many cases, made their fortunes in the preceding decade through finance, tech, real estate, or entertainment. Into this deeply traditional, deeply warm visual language, the aquarium introduced something the rest of the room had absolutely nothing else like. Cool, alien, moving light. Think about the color theory here for a second, because it's genuinely doing a lot of work. Everything else in a 90s luxury interior sits somewhere on the amber to brown spectrum. Wood tones, brass tones, warm incandescent lighting, deep jewel-toned upholstery. It's a warm palette, designed to feel cozy, established, weighty. And then you cut a hole in the middle of that warm palette and fill it with actinic blue light, the specific, slightly purple-tinged blue produced by the metal halide and fluorescent actinic bulbs used to promote coral growth. It's the exact opposite of every other light source in the house, where the rest of the room is static and solid. The aquarium is in constant gentle motion, fish moving, water rippling, light refracting and shimmering across the ceiling and walls in patterns that no static light fixture could produce. The effect is genuinely arresting, and it's not an accident. It's the same design principle behind a fireplace, or a chandelier, or any focal point meant to draw the eye, except supercharged, because instead of reflecting light, it's a self-illuminated, moving, living thing embedded directly in architecture that otherwise announces itself as motionless and permanent. There's a term for this that shows up a lot when you look at 90s design more broadly, and it's genuinely useful here. It's the collision of classicism and futurism. This is actually a broader signature of a lot of high-end 90s and early 2000s design. You see it in cars with wood-trim dashboards hiding digital displays, in luxury hotel lobbies mixing marble columns with fiber-optic ceiling installations, in the general Y2K adjacent aesthetic of traditional materials, futuristic accents that dominated upscale design. Right before minimalism swept it all away, the in-wall aquarium might be the single purest expression of that collision that 90s residential architecture ever produced. An old-world library wall, punched through with a literal window into cutting-edge marine biotechnology. And functionally, these tanks weren't randomly placed. They occupied one very specific architectural role, over and over again, in house after house. The status threshold. Look at where these tanks actually got built. Overwhelmingly, they were placed as room dividers between the most performative spaces in the house, the grand double-height foyer and the formal dining room, or the foyer and a home office, or occasionally between a living room and a family room. Almost never in a bedroom, almost never somewhere private. That's not a coincidence. It's the whole point. These are the transitional spaces where you, the guest, are meant to notice you're entering somewhere important. The foyer already does some of this work architecturally. The double-height ceiling, the sweeping staircase, the chandelier, the aquarium wall takes that same psychological cue. You are now somewhere significant, and turns the volume up to 11, because instead of simply looking expensive, it's doing something no other wall in any other house on the block is doing. It's alive. Positioning it as a divider between the foyer and the formal dining room in particular is almost diabolically well calculated as a piece of social choreography. Think about who's actually walking past that wall. Dinner guests. People invited specifically to be impressed. You walk in the front door. You're already registering the marble in the chandelier and the sweeping staircase. And then, right as you're being led toward the dining room, right as the evening's performance of hospitality and status is ramping up, the wall next to you turns into an ocean. It's a flex delivered with impeccable comedic timing, engineered directly into the floor plan. And there's a deeper, almost primal layer to why this specific display worked so well as a wealth signal. Beyond just, it's expensive and rare, bringing a living coral reef, an entire miniature marine ecosystem, complete with apex predator fish, delicate coral organisms, and a chemically engineered facsimile of ocean water, into your home and keeping it thriving indoors, in a landlocked suburb, is an extraordinary act of environmental control. It's not just owning something rare, it's demonstrating mastery over an entire natural system that would, under any normal circumstance, be utterly hostile to existing inside a house. Historically, this kind of gesture has deep roots. Wealthy landowners for centuries built greenhouses, orangeries, and private menageries specifically to display exotic plants and animals removed from their native climates and forced to thrive somewhere they had no business surviving. A literal, physical demonstration that your wealth extended to bending nature itself to your will. The 90s in-wall reef tank is a direct descendant of that impulse, just retooled with metal halide lighting and a protein skimmer instead of a heated glass conservatory. You weren't just showing guests that you could afford a nice fish tank. You were showing them that you had successfully imported the ocean, kept a piece of the Pacific reef alive and thriving, in a house in a zip code nowhere near a coastline. That's not decoration. That's a demonstration of dominance, quiet, glowing, and slightly show-offy dominance. But dominance all the same. It's worth pausing here to note how thoroughly this aesthetic saturated media representations of wealth during this exact window, because the pop culture footprint reinforced the trend as much as any single mansion did. Wealthy villains, crime bosses, and executives in film and television throughout the late 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s were disproportionately likely to have an office with a wall-mounted aquarium behind the desk. It became such a reliable visual shorthand for powerful, slightly menacing, extremely rich, that it crossed over into genuine cliché territory. Reality television's obsession with celebrity home tours throughout the 90s and into the 2000s only accelerated it further, turning what had started as a genuine engineering novelty into something closer to a required checkbox on the luxury home bingo card, right alongside the home theater, the wine cellar, and the his and hers walk-in closets. By the mid-90s, in other words, the in-wall aquarium had completed its transformation. It started as a genuine technical achievement. Architects and marine engineers solving a hard materials science and biology problem together. It ended as something closer to a cultural uniform. If you were building or renovating a certain caliber of house in this specific window of American history, this is simply what you did with one particular wall. Whether or not you had any actual interest in marine biology whatsoever, which, as it turns out, was exactly the problem. Chapter 4. The Nightmare Reality Behind the Glass. Here is the part of the story that almost never made it into the real estate listing photos. Behind every one of these glowing, effortless-looking walls of ocean was a genuinely relentless, genuinely expensive, genuinely stressful maintenance operation. And this is really where the story stops being about design and starts being about the gap between how something looks and what it actually costs, not just in dollars but in constant human labor, to keep looking that way. Let's start with the most insidious problem, because it's the one that quietly destroyed the most houses: salt creep. Saltwater aquariums, even well-maintained ones, produce a fine aerosol mist through the natural agitation of water movement, wave action, filtration return flow, the bubbling of a protein skimmer. That mist evaporates, and it leaves behind exactly what you'd expect: salt. Left unchecked, this creates a slow, creeping crust of crystallized salt on every nearby surface. And remember, the entire design premise of these builds was surrounding the tank with expensive, unsealed and porous hardwood millwork, cherry and mahogany trim, custom-fitted and finished to match the rest of a formal dining room. It is spectacularly bad at surviving decades of low-grade saline humidity. Salt is hygroscopic. It actively pulls moisture out of the air and holds it against whatever surface it's sitting on. Over months and years, that means slowly rotting wood from the inside, warping trim, and destroying the exact finish that made the built-in look so seamless and expensive in the first place. The wall that was engineered specifically to make the tank look like architecture rather than appliance was, quietly, the thing most vulnerable to the tank itself. Humidity, more broadly, was its own separate nightmare. A several hundred-gallon open or lightly covered saltwater system pumps a significant amount of moisture into the surrounding air, continuously, day and night, for years. In a poorly ventilated equipment room, and many of these builds, remember, were essentially closets retrofitted behind a wall, not purpose-built mechanical spaces. That humidity had nowhere to go. It condensed. It fed mold growth in wall cavities. It warped subflooring. Homeowners who commissioned these systems in the mid-90s were, more often than not, quietly signing up for a slow-motion moisture problem that wouldn't fully reveal itself for a decade. Then there was the water chemistry itself, which is genuinely unforgiving, even with 90s-era technological improvements. Saltwater reef tanks require constant monitoring and adjustment of salinity, pH, calcium levels, alkalinity, and temperature, any one of which drifting out of a fairly narrow band can trigger a cascading collapse of the whole ecosystem. Algae blooms were a constant visible enemy. Excess nutrients from fish waste or overfeeding, combined with the intense metal halide lighting these systems required, created ideal conditions for nuisance algae to explode across the glass, rock, and coral, turning a crystal-clear designer centerpiece into a murky green eyesore within days if left unattended. And all of this required power. A lot of it, continuously, forever. Metal halide lighting fixtures ran hot and hungry, often requiring multiple 250 or 400-watt bulbs, running on timers for 8 to 12-hour photo periods daily. Add in redundant pumps and chillers to counteract the heat those very lights produced, heaters for cooler months, and dosing equipment, and you had what amounted to a small industrial operation running continuously inside a residential wall, one that showed up every single month as a very real line item on the electric bill, long after the initial thrill of the installation had faded into background furniture. All of which explains one of the most quietly fascinating side effects of this entire trend. It created an entire cottage industry of specialized labor built to serve exactly one purpose: keeping rich people's walls alive. This is the aquarium guy phenomenon, and if you grew up around this world, you know exactly who I mean. Not a hobbyist, not the neighborhood kid who fed the fish while you were on vacation. A genuine specialist, often running a small dedicated marine systems service business, who would show up on a weekly, sometimes twice-weekly contracted basis to test water chemistry, replace filter media, clean the acrylic, trim coral, replace evaporated water, and generally keep the entire fragile system from collapsing. This wasn't optional, unlike a pool guy whose absence for a month means a green pool you can shock back to health. A neglected reef system can crash, meaning a total cascading die-off of fish and coral in a matter of days if a critical parameter goes unmonitored. Homeowners who had commissioned these systems specifically as effortless-looking status symbols found themselves locked into permanent, non-negotiable service contracts, often running into the hundreds of dollars per visit, simply to keep the flex flexing. It's a genuinely great piece of dramatic irony when you sit with it. The entire point of the in-wall aquarium was to project an image of seamless, casual, ocean-taming mastery. Nature, effortlessly bent to your will, glowing there in the wall as if it required nothing from you at all. The reality was the exact opposite. It required a small standing army of specialized technical labor on permanent retainer, just to maintain the illusion that you weren't doing anything at all. And then there's the failure mode that every aquarium service tech has at least one story about, told in the hushed, slightly traumatized tone reserved for genuine catastrophes. The leak, a 500-plus gallon system, built into a wall, sitting directly above finished hardwood floors, and, more often than not, a finished basement or crawl space below, is an enormous quantity of water held back by silicone seals, acrylic bonds, and plumbing fittings that are, ultimately, mechanical systems subject to wear, age, and failure. A cracked seam, a degraded gasket, a sump overflow during a power outage that knocked the return pump offline while the display drain kept running. When these systems failed, and over a long enough timeline, with enough of them installed, some inevitably did, the result wasn't a puddle. It was hundreds of gallons of salt water, in some documented cases enough to be measured in the thousands, pouring continuously into a house until someone noticed, soaking through hardwood, subflooring, drywall, and insulation, often in the middle of the night or during a vacation when nobody was home to catch it early. Saltwater is also uniquely nasty for this kind of damage, compared to a burst pipe, because the salt itself continues corroding metal fixtures, fasteners, and electrical components long after the water itself has been cleaned up or dried out. For a genuinely unlucky subset of homeowners, the ultimate 90s flex ended not with a dinner party compliment, but with a multi-$100,000 insurance claim, a gutted formal dining room, and a very pointed conversation with a contractor about whether it was worth rebuilding the tank at all, which, as the decade turned, an increasing number of homeowners decided it was not. Chapter 5. The Fall and Modern Legacy. Every architectural trend eventually runs into the same wall, pun very much intended, which is that taste moves in cycles, and the things that feel the most excitingly, aggressively contemporary in one decade are almost always the things that age the fastest and hardest into the next one. The in-wall aquarium's decline wasn't caused by any single event. It was death by 1,000 cultural cuts, spread out across roughly the 2005 to 2015 window, as several converging design and economic shifts made the entire concept feel almost overnight, in the way these things always seem to happen. Deeply, embarrassingly dated. The biggest cultural shift was the arrival and rapid dominance of what we'd now broadly call the grayscale minimalist aesthetic, the design language that would eventually calcify into the much-maimed modern farmhouse and gray box look that swept American residential design through the 2000s. This new aesthetic was, almost point for point, the photographic negative of the 90s luxury look it replaced. Where the 90s wanted dark wood, the 2000s wanted whitewashed oak and painted shiplap. Where the 90s wanted ornate layered detail, the 2010s wanted clean lines and negative space. Where the 90s wanted warm, amber-toned lighting, the 2010s wanted cool white and natural daylight. maximized through enormous banks of unadorned glass. And this is the part that mattered most for our glowing blue wall specifically. The 2010s design language was obsessed, above almost everything else, with openness. The open concept floor plan. Kitchen flowing into living room, flowing into dining area, with minimal interior walls at all, became the single most dominant residential layout trend of the decade. Real estate listings started actively marketing the absence of walls as a premium feature. You can immediately see the problem. The in-wall aquarium's entire architectural logic depended on walls existing in the first place, specifically on formal, separate, distinct rooms that needed a dramatic threshold between them. An open concept floor plan doesn't have a foyer to dining room wall to build an aquarium into, because it doesn't really have a foyer to dining room wall. Full stop. The entire spatial concept that gave the in-wall aquarium its purpose was being architecturally phased out from underneath it. Add to that the broader minimalist design principle that would come to dominate the era, a kind of restrained, quiet luxury sensibility that treated visual restraint itself as the ultimate status signal, the opposite of 90s maximalism's belief that more visible expense equals more status. And you can see why the entire concept started to feel less like timeless luxury and more like a very specific, very dated punchline. A glowing wall of tropical fish embedded in dark cherry wood didn't read as, "We have arrived," anymore. It read as, "This house hasn't been updated since 1997, which, in an increasing number of cases, was simply true. There's also a simpler economic story running underneath all of this, the specific late 80s through 90s boom economy that made commission a load-bearing living ecosystem into your wall seem like a reasonable use of disposable income, eventually gave way to leaner, more risk-conscious eras. The dot-com crash, the 2008 financial crisis, and a broader generational shift in how newly wealthy buyers wanted to spend and display money, favoring experiences, travel, and understated design over the visible, maintenance-heavy maximalism of the previous generation. So, what actually happened to all of them? For a genuinely staggering number of these systems, the answer is the least glamorous one imaginable. They were simply shut down. As original homeowners aged out of these houses, downsized, passed away, or sold to buyers with zero interest in inheriting a several hundred-gallon marine biology project, along with their new mortgage, the maintenance stopped. Fish and coral, without their weekly specialist visits, don't survive long. Many of these tanks were quietly drained, the equipment sold or scrapped, and the acrylic void left sitting empty inside the wall. A strange glass-fronted cavity that new owners often didn't know what to do with. A meaningful subset were fully demolished during subsequent renovations. The wall reframed, drywalled solid, and the entire multi-hundred-gallon cavity and its dedicated equipment room either sealed off entirely or repurposed as a closet, pantry, or additional storage, erasing any trace that an ocean once lived there. A smaller number found a kind of practical afterlife as dry display cases, the acrylic shell retained, the plumbing and life support stripped out, repurposed to hold anything from wine collections to model ships, to, in one genuinely 2020s twist, a home office monitor setup, the glowing blue reef replaced by the glowing blue of an ultra-wide display. The bones of the flex remained. The biology did not. And then there's the rarest category, and honestly, the most delightful one. The houses where the original system survived, fully intact and still running, either because a subsequent owner genuinely loved it and kept the maintenance contract going, or, increasingly, in the past several years, because a new generation of retro and Y2K aesthetic enthusiasts specifically sought out these homes as time capsules worth preserving rather than gutting. There's something genuinely moving about that last category, actually. In an era where the dominant online design conversation is often about the sameness of contemporary interiors, the so-called airspace aesthetic, the same gray sofa, and the same potted fiddle leaf fig, showing up in every Instagram-optimized listing from Miami to Seattle. A fully intact, original 1994 mahogany and brass in-wall saltwater aquarium reads not as dated anymore, but as specific, weird, genuinely unmistakably of a particular place and time, in a way almost nothing being built today is, which, in the end, might be the most honest way to think about why this trend matters enough to spend 30 minutes on. The in-wall aquarium wasn't just a fish tank, and it was never really only about status either, although it was absolutely unapologetically that too. It was a genuinely rare moment where materials science, marine biology, interior design, and pure economic bravado all lined up at exactly the same time and produced something that could only have existed in that narrow window. You needed the acrylic technology. You needed the reef-keeping breakthroughs. You needed the specific maximalist wood and brass aesthetic of the moment. And you needed an economy confident enough to bankroll something this gloriously, structurally unnecessary. Take away any one ingredient, and you don't get the wall. You get a normal fish tank sitting quietly in a normal corner, doing none of the cultural work this thing was doing. So, the next time you're scrolling through an old real estate listing, or catching a rerun of some 90s sitcom rich guy mansion, and you spot that wall, the warm mahogany interrupted by a rectangle of impossible blue, a yellow tang drifting past in the background like it's the most normal thing in the world, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Not just a fish tank. A perfect, glowing, slightly leaky monument to a very specific decade's very specific idea of what it meant to have made it.